Today is episode 11 and it's day 6 of our national lockdown. Today we're looking at Matthew chapter 9 verses 14 through to 17 as we continue our reflections, our meditations, our simple studies in the Gospel of Matthew. And so we pick up the story. Then the disciples of John came to Jesus saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, or the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise the skins burst and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so that both are preserved." Well, this seems a kind of peculiar text, doesn't it? It starts with fasting, and then Jesus goes and talks about wedding guests and bridegrooms, and then it moves on to something completely different, or so it seems, where it moves on to old clothes and new wineskins. And I've struggled, frankly, to try and make the connections. And we could imagine that, well, perhaps they're just misplaced texts. Perhaps they don't have anything to do with one another. The thing is this, that it appears in this formula in all three synoptics. It's in Matthew, Mark and Luke. And they all do it consistently with pretty well the same wording. So it seems to me that there's something here for us. And so we're considering what that might be. Now the first thing I observe is that the way that we have it in the English is perhaps a little unhelpful. The question that the disciples of John bring, now just remember at this point that in Matthew's Gospel, John is in prison. So his disciples are kind of leaderless, they're rudderless, and they're looking at what's going on and trying to make sense of everything. So they come to Jesus and they ask, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Now in the English that can be so asking the question, so why are we fasting? Which is kind of odd, really. Presumably you know why you're fasting, or maybe you don't, and if you don't, perhaps you ought to stop. The real question that they're asking is why are your disciples not fasting? Because we do, and the Pharisees do, we do it a lot. Why are your disciples not fasting? That really is the question. And it leads into an analogy that Jesus uses about a bridegroom. He says that the wedding preparations are continuing until the bridegroom arrives. Then what is done, all that's been completed has been completed, and the wedding starts. The bridegroom has arrived, the party is underway. If you haven't got it done by now, you're not going to get it done. But let's get on with the wedding. And Jesus is drawing an analogy between that and himself. He's saying, I'm the bridegroom. He says, I'm here, so we no longer need to do the preparations. Because that's what fasting is. It's a preparation. It's a preparation for something else. It's a preparation for opening ourselves to experience the presence of God. See, the thing is that we are spiritual beings living in physical bodies. That's what we are. We are a spiritual being with a physical body. And our spirits often mirror our bodies. That what we do with our bodies affects our spirits. And so that when we fast and we deprive ourselves of food, it grows a hunger within us. And there's a sense of spiritual mirroring within us. It opens us just that little more to the possibility of God working in us. we become a little bit more attentive. We become a little bit more open. It becomes possible for us that we might experience one of those thin places where there's this kind of encounter with the Spirit and with the presence of God. But there needs to be a preparation. There needs to be a kind of hunger. I don't think that many of us are keen on prayer when our stomachs are full. We're satiated, most of us. Many of us just want to snooze, just want to relax, just want to sleep. You may be different. That's how it is for me. And I suspect I'm not uncommon in that respect. I observed my father-in-law, who was a farmer. And he was actually very good with dogs. He would always run a couple of dogs who would round up the sheep for him. The thing he did, though, was he always fed them last thing at night. The last thing he did is dogs were in their cages, they'd had a day's work, and then he'd feed them. And I asked him, why not feed them in the morning? He said, a dog won't work on a full stomach. And I think we're a bit like that as well. I know that's true for me. I don't work well on a full stomach. On a Sunday morning, as I'm preparing to offer what I believe the Lord has laid on my heart, I never eat beforehand. There's always got to be a kind of sense of hunger. And I think this is what fasting does, is it evokes in us something that is more than just spiritual. It's physical. It opens us with a potential clarity to experiencing God. And John's disciples and the Pharisees understand this. Fasting is part of their daily or at least weekly disciplines, as they too want to experience God. And what this is telling us, when we actually consider the analogy that Jesus uses, is that the disciples of John do not experience Jesus or do not see him as Emmanuel, God with us. They just don't get that bit. They see him potentially, I suspect, as a competitor to their leader, which is John. They don't see him as really the one that John was pointing to as the Emmanuel, the God who was with us. And hence Jesus' response about the bridegroom. Then Jesus segues, and it looks like a complete segue into something completely different. He talks about repairing old clothes and where we need to store new wine. Now, when we look at the picture, what happens with clothing, most of our stuff is kind of pre-shrunk that we buy off the shelves. But in those days, when they would make a garment, they would then shrink it. They would then put it in water, and I guess there'll be a bit of heat added to it, and the garment would shrink. And it's true of many garments. And so you would make it over big, presumably, in order for it to fit the person. You didn't want to get wet. You didn't want the thing to shrink and discover it's now unusable. And so when it comes to repairing an old garment, it's got a hole in it. It needs a patch. You've worn it out at the knees because you've spent all your day praying, and you need to put a patch on your knees. You actually need a piece of cloth that has been shrunk beforehand. You don't just put a piece of new cloth on it, because the moment you wash it, the cloth will contract and will tear at the stitches and will make the hole that was there before even worse. So that's that image. You also have the image of the wineskins. If you take an old wineskin which has already been used, it is now rigid and hard. Sure, it'll take stuff, but if you put new wine in it, new wine which is lively and bubbly and growing in wind, it will press against the wineskin and burst it. You need for new wine a new wineskin. One that is still stretchable, one that is still flexible, one where you can put the wine in and the wineskin will expand as the wine expands, and both are preserved. So what is Jesus saying here? I believe he's inviting us to recognize that there are seasons in life. Just as there's a season of preparation, there's a season where things are being done. As we wait for the presence of God, as God is with us, there are specific seasons. So we specifically don't fast when God is present with us. Why do we need to do that? God is sitting in the room. God is present. Why would we need to fast? And this is what Jesus is saying. And we're all in seasons, but not the same ones. This is where these images of the old wineskins and the new wineskins and the old clothes come in. The best analogy I'm able to come up with, and this is particularly for people who are familiar with the church, is what happens with congregations. Now let's imagine, for example, we've got an aging congregation, a bit like ours, and it's one which is used to a traditional style of worship, what I've often called a four-hymn sandwich, where we have space, where we have a set thing. It's respectful, it's reasonably quiet. We have the hymns that are familiar and speak to our spirits because we've grown up with them. And we observe that the church is diminishing because we're not getting a whole lot of people who presumably like this style of worship. And so the new pastor comes along and says, well, what we've got to do is we've got to introduce new music. We've got to lift the tempo. We've got to lift the volume. We've got to get contemporary. How's that going to go down? People come along with earplugs. People start to grumble. This is old clothes in which a new piece of cloth is being sewn in. And it does damage. It just makes the tear worse, and people leave, and the church finds itself in a worse situation than it was before. There's a season, and there's recognizing the season, recognizing that this group of people actually don't need this, and that there may be a whole lot of people out there that are just like them that would appreciate what they had if we were able to market it differently, make it more inclusive. I don't know. But if we were able to recognize that this is the season that we're in. And then it may be the image we have is of new wine and old wineskins. We bring a group of young people in and force them to submit to the old way of being. And what happens? The wineskins get burst and all the wine leaks out. It doesn't work for the young people either, the ones who have come in. It just doesn't work. They're not clamouring, I don't seem anyway, to get into our more traditional churches. Expecting them to conform does damage to them and to us. We need pre-shrunk cloth for old clothes. And we need new wineskins for new wine. It's important for each of us to recognise the season that we're in. And we're not all in the same season. We see that with the churches. We see some people for whom this is the season. Life is full of rah-rah. And we see those of us who are growing older, we actually need a more reflective, a more contemplative style of worship where our souls can get nourished. For both groups, they receive what they need, but they're not the same. We're in different seasons. It's important to recognise the season that we're in. And things may have changed a lot for you, as they have for me in this past week or so. And the question that we each perhaps need to be asking ourselves is, so what season do I find myself in now? What's important that I do now? And I want to suggest that the first question we can ask ourselves is, what's right in front of me? What is it that I have right in front of me that I can do now? And what gifts and graces has God given me to be able to respond to this moment? What has God equipped me with? What has the years prepared me for in this moment? One of the things that you might have right now is time. You might have quite a bit of it on your hands and be asking yourself, what am I going to do with all of this? Is my next 3 weeks to be spent simply doing jigsaw puzzles? And it could be. Is that the most creative and useful and life-giving way that I can spend this time? Or are there other ways I can do this? You see, the question I've asked is, what can I do? Well, friends, I'm doing it. I'm doing this because I can. I'm doing this because it's right in front of me. I'm doing this because it seems that God has singularly equipped me to do this in this moment. How effective it will be, it's not for me to judge. I do know, though, that I'm doing what I sense I can do and what God has gifted and equipped me to do right now. There's a wonderful passage, an expression that I love, that we find in Exodus chapter 4. When Moses is encountering Yahweh at the burning bush, and God calls him to go to Egypt. And he says, well, I can't do that. I just don't know how I would do that. I've got nothing to take. And God asks him the question in verse 2. He says to him, what's in your hand? And he has a staff, he has a large stick. And God says, just give some instructions as to how to use it. And I believe that's the question that God would actually ask each of us. What's in your hand? What has God put in your hand right now to be able to make a difference in the season in which you find yourselves? How are you responding? How might you respond? What resources has God equipped you with? What yearnings in your heart might be responded to? How might you say yes to God and take up what's in your hand in this moment? It seems this is how it's finishing these days, doesn't it?